The morning of May 19th, 1536, dawned cold and gray over the Tower of London. The ravens perched on the weathered battlements had seen countless deaths before, but none so infamous as this. Beneath the high stone walls, a woman once crowned Queen of England knelt in silence, her lips whispering prayers to a god she no longer knew would listen. And Boleyn, the woman who had defied a king, redefined a kingdom, and given birth to a future monarch, was about to lose her head. Yet the true horror of her final hours lies not in the blade itself, but in the moments leading to it. The waiting, the whispers, the unbearable dignity of a doomed queen walking toward her own execution. If you ever wondered what truly endured in those last hours, not the sanitized history book version, but the real, human story filled with fear, betrayal, and eerie calm, this is that story. The echo of her steps, the tremor in her voice, the way her fate reshaped a nation, all of it began in the silence before the axe fell. If you're drawn to the untold tragedies and haunting truths that shaped our past, like and subscribe for more real lives and real deaths from history's darkest corners. The Tower of London has always carried a silence that speaks. Even in the soft hours before dawn, when the river mists drift like ghosts through its courtyards, one can feel the weight of all who have suffered within its walls. In early May of 1536, that silence wrapped itself around in Boleyn. The Queen of England, once radiant, untouchable, adored, was now a prisoner in the same fortress where she had been crowned with triumph just 3 years before. The irony was cruel. The same trumpets that once proclaimed her as Henry's rightful wife now echoed only in memory, replaced by the distant cry of ravens and the tolling of chapel bells. Her chamber was not a dungeon, but it may as well have been. The room, with its narrow windows and damp stone, offered little comfort, for ladies were assigned to attend her, not out of kindness, but to watch her every word, every sigh, every tear. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows across the walls as she knelt in prayer, her hands trembling not from cold but from the terror of uncertainty. She whispered her innocence to God, to herself, perhaps even to the stone floor that seemed to listen more than the men outside her door. Each night she lay awake, hearing the footsteps of guards and wondering which of them might come for her in the morning, and was never a woman to surrender easily. Her mind, sharp as ever, turned over every detail, every ally lost, every whisper at court, every fleeting expression on the king's face. Henry had once sworn that he would rather beg in the streets than live without her. Now, he would not even look upon her face. The weight of betrayal was almost heavier than the fear of death, yet there were moments, rare and brief, when she still believed he might change his mind. Perhaps he would remember their love, their daughter, the vows they had made before God. But as the hours stretched and the tower bells marked time with unfeeling precision, that hope began to die, one toll at a time. In the stillness of those nights, Anne's thoughts turned to Elizabeth, the child she would never see again. She imagined her daughter's red gold hair, the delicate fingers that once clutched at her gown. Did Henry look at Elizabeth and see her? Or did he turn away, pretending the child was fatherless, like the mother he now disowned? The thought was unbearable. And prayed harder, not for mercy, not for life, but for her daughter's safety, for a future she herself would never touch. The tower walls held her body, but her spirit reached beyond them, clinging to the faint, impossible dream that her bloodline would not end in disgrace. Outside, the May air grew warmer. The gardens beyond the tower bloomed as if mocking her despair. Life, it seemed, refused to mourn. Yet inside that room, time had stopped. Every breath and took felt borrowed. Every heartbeat of defiance against the silence that waited to claim her. Morning came slowly in the tower, not with sunlight, but with the sound of iron hinges and murmured prayers. The soft scrape of a key turning in a lock signaled another day and would not see beyond the stone walls. Her ladies entered quietly, their eyes downcast, each of them chosen not for loyalty but for obedience. They dressed her in a plain gown of gray damask, the fabric rougher than she had ever known as queen. Even the air seemed to change around her, stripped of perfume and music, filled only with the dull rhythm of footsteps in the corridors. And composure was remarkable, though it wavered when the silence grew too deep. She would speak suddenly, as if her voice might shatter the air, of scripture, of fate, Of Henry. He loved me once, she would murmur, almost to herself. He loved me enough to break a kingdom. Then her eyes would darken, her lips tightening into a thin line. Love, she knew, had never been enough for kings. Kings demanded heirs, and Henry's patience had long since turned to ash. Rumors drifted even to the tower walls. Whispers that her alleged lovers had already confessed that her brother George would be tried alongside her. The guards avoided her gaze, as though her presence carried a curse. But Anne's pride refused to die. When a lieutenant of the tower came to her chamber to relay orders, she stood with regal poise and thanked him with words that carried both dignity and quiet reproach. "I have always been true to the king," she said softly. "God knows it, even if man will not." In the chapel, she knelt upon cold stone and prayed aloud, her voice trembling but clear. Those who heard her later said it was not the prayer of a guilty woman, but of one desperate to be remembered rightly. She prayed for Henry, for Elizabeth, for her enemies. And in her final plea, she prayed for herself, not for pardon, but for strength to meet what was coming with grace. Outside her window, a faint wind stirred the ivy along the tower walls. The Thames whispered against its banks, carrying the faint sounds of a city that would soon awake, unaware that its queen was counting her last days. Somewhere beyond the mist, church bells rang for matins. Their echo lingered long after the sound itself had died, a haunting reminder that time, indifferent and relentless, was moving closer to the morning of May 19th. By the third night in the tower, Anne's prayers had grown quieter. They were no longer the fervent pleas of a queen seeking justice, but the subdued murmurs of a woman speaking only to herself. Sleep had abandoned her entirely. Each time her eyes drifted shut, she heard the echo of her own name, whispered in the corridors, uttered in judgment, spoken as though it no longer belonged to her. The air was thick with damp and the faint scent of wax from the dying candles. She stared at their flames until they blurred, imagining them as souls, hers among them, flickering, waiting for release. The women assigned to attend her tried to offer comfort, though they themselves were uneasy in her presence. One of them, Lady Kingston, later wrote that it alternated between eerie calm and sudden bursts of laughter so fragile it broke the hearts of those who heard it. "They say I am guilty," she once said to trembling lips, "yet none of them can tell me what crime I am most damned, of loving too fiercely, or of giving birth to a daughter instead of a son." The room fell silent. Even the guards beyond the door seemed to pause, unwilling to interrupt the confession of a broken queen. Outside, the tower ground slept beneath a veil of fog. Somewhere nearby, a bell struck the hour, and Anne rose from her knees to gaze out through the narrow slit of her window. Beyond the curtain of mist, she could almost see the city, the faint flicker of torches, the spires of churches, the dark waters of the Thames. Life continued, indifferent to her suffering. The people who had once cheered her coronation now whispered her name with pity or contempt. It was a loneliness unlike any she had ever known. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the deeper, colder kind that comes when the world decides you are already dead. As dawn neared, Anne pressed her hand to her chest and whispered a final prayer. She no longer begged for Henry's mercy. She knew it would not come. Instead, she prayed for courage, the courage to stand, to speak, to face the inevitable with the grace of the woman she had always claimed to be. She thought of her mother, her father, her brother George. She thought of Elizabeth most of all. And for the first time, she allowed herself to weep, not for a crown, not even for her life, but for the child who would grow up motherless in a court built on treachery. When the first light crept across the tower walls, she composed herself once more. The Queen of England was gone. What remained was in Boleyn, a woman waiting for judgment. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor. The herald of messengers come to summon her for trial. She straightened her back, wiped her tears, and whispered, "I am ready." But her voice trembled as she said it, for readiness was a lie no mortal could truly claim before death. The door opened, the guards bowed their heads, and the long walk toward her fate began. The great hall at Westminster was crowded with faces, some hungry for justice, others for spectacle. On May 15th, 1536, and Boleyn, once crowned Queen of England, stood before a tribunal of peers who had already decided her fate. The trial was meant to resemble fairness, but everyone in that room knew it was theater. The charges read aloud: adultery, incest, high treason, were accusations so monstrous they could only have been designed to annihilate her name completely. Yet when Anne entered, every whisper faltered. Even stripped of her crown, she carried herself like a queen. She wore a gown of black velvet, her hair gathered beneath a simple cap. No jewels adorned her neck. Her only ornament was a composure that refused to break. When the Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, presided as Lord High Steward, his voice wavered as he called her name. "And, Queen of England, thou art here indicted and accused." The words rolled like thunder across the hall. Every syllable struck her like a blow, yet she never lowered her gaze. She looked upon her accusers, men who had once bowed to her at court, and she saw not judgment, but fear. Fear of Henry, fear of losing favor, fear of being the next to fall. Among the accused stood her brother, George Boleyn, elegant, proud, unflinching. Their eyes met only once, but in that fleeting glance was a lifetime of shared memory. Childhood laughter, courtly ambition, the rise that had been too swift, too brilliant. Now they would fall together. The charges against them were crueler still. Accusations of incest whispered by men who knew such lies were the surest way to poison their bloodline forever. When Anne was asked to plead, she lifted her chin and spoke with a calmness that silenced even the most hostile in the crowd. "I do not say I am guiltless," she began softly, "for I know of many failings. But as for the great sin they lay upon me, I am clear of it as any soul before God." The clerk paused, uncertain, as if her serenity unsettled the entire ritual. A woman so calm in the face of ruin must either be innocent or possessed. In the murmurs that followed, neither side could agree which was worse. The evidence presented was thin, absurd even. Lovers who had allegedly met her in impossible places at impossible times. One man was said to have sinned with her on a day. He could prove he was miles away. Another had already confessed under torture, his words shaped by pain and terror. But logic was not the currency of Tudor justice. The trial's outcome had been purchased long before it began. Henry's court demanded blood, not truth. Still, and spoke clearly, never pleading, never weeping. "If I am condemned," she said, her voice steady, "it shall not be for lack of innocence, but for want of mercy." Her words hung in the air, haunting and defiant. The Duke of Norfolk avoided her eyes. The nobles shifted uneasily. Even the scribe seemed hesitant to record her final statement, as though writing it would make them complicit in the lie. Outside, the bells of London tolled faintly through the open windows. The city moved as it always did, unaware that within these walls, a queen was being unmade. When the verdict was read, the air itself seemed to wither. No one dared to move, no one dared to breathe. Guilty. The word hung in the rafters like smoke, clinging to every stone and soul within the hall, and stood motionless. Her face betrayed nothing, no tears, no anger, only a strange serenity, as though she had long since made peace with this moment. But beneath that calm, her heart beat wildly, a drum against the silence. The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, was the one to deliver her sentence. His voice trembled, though whether from sorrow or fear, none could tell. "You shall be taken to the Tower of London, and there, at the king's pleasure, you shall be either burned or beheaded." The words cut through her like a blade, and bowed her head slightly, then raised it again with quiet defiance. "Masters," she said, her voice steady, "I do not accuse any man of my condemnation. I believe truly that God knows my innocence, and I submit myself to his mercy." The composure of her tone unsettled even her enemies. She sounded less like a traitor and more like a saint awaiting martyrdom. In that instant, the court saw what Henry could not, that by destroying her, he was creating something immortal, a legend, a ghost, a woman who would haunt his name forever. But Henry was not there to witness it. He had withdrawn to his palace at Whitehall, far from the spectacle he had ordered, pretending that his absence cleansed his hands of guilt. They said he was already planning his next marriage, to Jane Seymour, before Anne's trial had even ended. To Anne, That betrayal was the cruelest cut of all. Love, it seemed, had been a game she had never truly understood. When the guards escorted her back to the tower, she walked between them like a shadow of her former self. Outside, the sky was heavy and gray. The city that had once cheered her coronation now waited in uneasy silence for her death. As she crossed the tower courtyard, she paused for a brief moment and looked toward the chapel where George had been executed. "Poor brother," she whispered. "We fly soon after one another." Then she straightened, her steps light but certain, as though she were walking not toward death, but toward a truth greater than any throne could offer. That night, as the candles burned low, and knelt in her chamber, hands clasped tightly, her lips moved without sound. No one knows what she prayed for. Perhaps for Elizabeth, perhaps for forgiveness, perhaps the soul of the man who had once called her his only love. But when she rose again, her face was transformed. There was no fear now, only stillness. The storm had passed within her. All that remained was a quiet readiness for the dawn that would bring her final day. The day before her execution, the tower was unervingly still. Even the guards spoke in whispers, as if afraid their voices might disturb the ghost that in Boleyn was soon to become. The May air was warm that morning, carrying the scent of river water and spring blossoms from the gardens beyond the walls. It should have been a day for life, for laughter, for sunlight. Instead, it was a day for endings, and woke early, before the first bells, her mind heavy with the knowledge that this sunrise might be her last. She asked for her chaplain, Bishop Matthew Parker, to pray with her, and together they recited psalms in the dim light of her chamber. The sound of her voice was soft but steady, her faith intact even as the world crumbled around her. "Remember me, O Lord," she whispered, "for I am but dust." The chaplain wept quietly, and she, with unexpected tenderness, placed a hand upon his arm. "Do not grieve for me," she said, "for I go to a better place, and I die in the king's good grace." Later that day, she was brought her final meal, bread, wine, and a few small dishes from the royal kitchens. She barely touched the food, but she insisted her ladies eat, urging them to smile, to live, to remember her kindly. "Do not weep," she told them, "for I have long been prepared. Death is but the shortest way to heaven." Yet as she spoke, her hands trembled slightly, and her gaze drifted toward the narrow window that framed the gray London sky. Somewhere beyond that horizon was her daughter, her Elizabeth, too young to understand that her mother's name was already a whisper of disgrace. The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, entered to inform her that the king had granted her a final mercy. She would not burn, but die swiftly by the sword. A French executioner had been sent for, the finest in Europe, known for his precision and grace, and bowed her head, murmuring her thanks, though her lips quivered when she spoke. "His Majesty is ever merciful," she said, the irony hanging sharp in the air. When Kingston hesitated to meet her gaze, she smiled faintly. "Do not be troubled, sir. I bear no malice toward him. He is still my lord, and I his most loyal wife, even now." As the evening descended and asked for her musicians, they played softly, the mournful strains of the lute echoing through the chamber. She listened with her eyes closed, her fingers tracing invisible patterns upon her skirt. Those who were there said she laughed once, quietly, when a string broke mid-song. "Even the music dies before me," she whispered, and the room fell into a silence no one dared disturb. When the last candle flickered low, she knelt once more upon the cold stone floor and prayed not for rescue, but for peace. Her body shook with quiet sobs, though her voice remained steady as she whispered her final prayer of the night. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Outside, the moon rose over the tower, casting a pale light upon the scaffold that stood waiting, stark, unfinished, and patient. Tomorrow, that light would fall upon her face one last time. Night settled over the tower like a veil of mourning. The city beyond its walls pulsed with distant life. The low hum of taverns, the muffled bells from St. Paul's, the murmur of a world that no longer belonged to her. Inside her chamber, the candlelight had grown dim and golden, trembling against the stone as if afraid of the darkness that waited. And Boleyn sat alone now, her attendants dismissed at her request. She needed silence, not the fearful quiet of imprisonment, but the kind of stillness one seeks before confession. For the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself to think freely, without performance, without pride. What had it all been for? A crown of gold, a daughter of fire, a love that consumed a kingdom. She had climbed so high, not knowing that the air above the court was too thin to breathe. Ambition had been her companion, passion her compass. But now, stripped of both, she was only and again the girl who once played the lute in her father's halls, who had laughed at poetry, who had dreamed of love without fear. The clock struck 11. Each chime echoed through the chamber, deliberate and slow, marking the rhythm of her dwindling time. She rose, her gown whispering against the floor, and approached the small mirror that hung beside her bed. The face reflected there startled her, pale, hollow, yet strangely serene. Death had already begun its quiet work upon her features, softening the pride, leaving behind something almost otherworldly. She touched her neck lightly, tracing the spot where the sword would fall, and whispered to her reflection, "It will be quick. They say the Frenchman is skilled. I shall not suffer." Her ladies returned near midnight, carrying candles and small comforts, a rosary, a cup of spiced wine, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. She thanked them each by name, her voice steady but gentle, as though she were the hostess of a quiet supper rather than a condemned queen. One of them began to weep, and then took her hand. "Do not cry for me," she said softly. "My life was glorious, if brief. Better to be remembered for a moment of flame than a lifetime of smoke." Before she lay down, she knelt once more at the bedside and prayed for Henry. "God, protect him," she murmured, "and give him the son he so desires. Let him find peace, even if it must be through my death." The words caught in her throat, but she forced herself to finish them. Forgiveness was her final act of defiance. When she finally lay upon the narrow bed, she did not close her eyes immediately. She listened to the faint wind against the window, to the footsteps of the guards outside, to the breathing of her attendants who dared not sleep. The tower itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond its gates, the executioner from Calais was sharpening his blade beneath the moonlight, preparing for dawn, and his lips curved into the faintest smile, not of joy but of weary acceptance. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "I go to meet my Maker, and perhaps find mercy at last." Then, as the first light of morning crept pale and cold across the stones, the Queen of England closed her eyes and slept her final sleep on earth. Dawn rose pale and sorrowful over the Tower of London. The fog rolled low along the river, curling around the ancient stones like a shroud. Within those walls, the scaffold waited, a simple wooden platform draped in straw to catch the blood of a queen. Nearby, a single sword gleamed in the light, its edge newly whetted, its purpose certain. The French executioner, summoned across the channel by Henry's command, stood apart from the others, silent beneath his hood. He was a man accustomed to death, yet even he felt the weight of what this morning would demand. To strike the head of a crowned queen, swiftly, cleanly, without hesitation, was no ordinary task, and awoke before the call of the guard. She rose without help, her movements graceful and deliberate. When her women offered her a dark cloak, she refused it, choosing instead a gown of deep crimson, the color of martyrdom. Over it she wore a gray mantle trimmed with ermine, and her hair she bound beneath a linen cap. Her beauty, though worn by sleepless nights, still shone in a way that unsettled even her captors. "Does she not seem more like an angel than a sinner?" one of them murmured as she passed. Sir William Kingston, the lieutenant of the Tower, came to her door with sorrow in his eyes. "Madam," he said softly, "the time has come," and thanked him with a small nod. "I am ready," she replied. Her voice held no tremor, only calm resignation. She took from her attendant a small prayer book, kissed its cover, and held it close to her heart. As she stepped into the corridor, the cold air met her skin like a baptism. The walk to the scaffold was short, but each step carried the weight of years, of ambition, of love, of ruin. Around her, the morning stirred with faint sounds, the cawing of ravens, the murmur of the gathered crowd beyond the tower gates, the creak of wood as soldiers adjusted their posts. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to look at the faces that watched her. They were not enemies, not truly. They were witnesses to a story larger than any of them could comprehend. When she reached the platform, she paused. The executioner bowed deeply before her, removing his cap. "Madam," he said in his accented English, "I crave your majesty's forgiveness. It is the king's command, not mine," and looked at him with an expression so kind that it seemed almost unreal. "I forgive you with all my heart," she said. "To your office well, and I shall say only, Jesu, have mercy on my soul." Those gathered said that the wind changed then, that a sudden stillness fell over the courtyard as though heaven itself held its breath, and knelt upon the straw, her skirts carefully arranged, her lips moving in silent prayer. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale light upon her bowed head. The Frenchman stepped closer, the sword glinting in his hand. He called softly for his assistant to fetch his blade, a trick of mercy, meant to distract her from the moment of the strike. She turned her head slightly, expecting the call to come from behind her, and in that brief, blessed instant of distraction, the sword flashed. The sword fell so swiftly that those watching barely saw the motion. A flash of light, a gasp from the crowd, and then silence. For a moment, it seemed the world itself had stopped, and Boleyn's body slumped forward, her hands still clasped in prayer, her head resting gently upon the straw beside her. No cry, no struggle, no sound of pain, only the faint thud of finality, the sound of a kingdom's conscience striking the earth. The executioner stepped back, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on what he had done. He had been paid handsomely for his skill, yet no gold could cleanse a heaviness that settled in his chest. To take a life was his trade, to take a queen's, something else entirely. He knelt briefly, whispering a prayer in his native French, before covering her remains with a linen cloth. The onlookers, courtiers, soldiers, and a few trembling ladies remained motionless. None dared speak. Even the ravens on the tower walls seemed struck into reverence. Sir William Kingston wiped his face, though whether from sweat or tears, he could not say. "It is done," he murmured, his voice breaking the spell that held them all. Two yeomen stepped forward and lifted Anne's body with careful hands. There was no coffin, only an arrow chest, hastily found to serve as her resting place. Her head was placed beside her, wrapped in white linen. No priest recited a final prayer. No bell tolled. A Queen of England was buried in silence beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the same chapel that had once echoed with her laughter during her coronation feast. Outside the tower, the crowd began to stir, uncertain whether to cheer or mourn. Some crossed themselves. Others hurried away as though ashamed to have looked upon her death. London's air carried the strange heaviness of remorse, a kingdom aware that something sacred had been broken. The gossip-mongers would later claim the sword had shone unnaturally bright, or that her lips had moved even after the strike, whispering her daughter's name. But those who stood closest said only this, that she died with courage, and that her final prayer had been for the man who ordered her death. At Whitehall, Henry received the news before noon. He was said to have sighed once, then turned to speak of his forthcoming marriage to Jane Seymour. The court followed his lead, eager to erase the morning's grim memory. But history does not forget so easily. The tower remembered. The stones that drank her blood remembered. And the wind that swept over the Thames carried her name long after the last witness had gone. That night, the French executioner departed quietly, his pay hidden beneath his cloak. He would never again speak of the English queen. Yet as his ship crossed the gray waters back toward Calais, he felt the weight of something unseen pressing upon him, the burden of having ended a legend. Behind him, the tower stood silent beneath the moon, and within its chapel and Boleyn's body lay cold but unbroken. Her story only just began to echo through the centuries. The morning after Boleyn's death, London awoke to uneasy quiet. The river mist clung to the rooftops, muffling the usual sounds of traders' carts and cries from the market. For a few brief hours, it was as though the entire city paused to reckon with what it had witnessed. Yet by midday, life resumed. The same merchants sold their wares, the same bells tolled for mass, and the same tongues whispered of royal marriages yet to come. The world had moved on, but a shadow lingered. Anne's ghost, though unacknowledged, had already begun its long reign. Inside the tower, Sir William Kingston made his report to King. The sentence had been carried out swiftly and mercifully. Henry read it without emotion, his pen scratching his signature at the bottom before he turned away to speak of preparations for his new queen. By evening, banners of white and gold would adorn the halls at Whitehall Palace. Colors of purity and joy, mocking the fresh blood that still stained the tower's stones. But in private, even Henry was restless. It was said that he did not sleep that night, that he walked the length of his chambers muttering prayers or curses under his breath. Perhaps he saw her in the candlelight, the tilt of her smile, the flash of her eyes, the memory of her voice whispering promises that had now turned to dust. News of her death spread quickly across England and beyond. In France, where she had once served at court, old friends mourned her softly, speaking of her wit and charm. In Rome, the Vatican viewed her fall as divine justice for England's heresy. But among the English people, the feeling was more complex. Some said she had bewitched the king and deserved her fate. Others whispered that she had died a martyr, a woman undone not by sin, but by the sin of defying power. None could deny her courage. And then there was Elizabeth. The child, barely 3 years old, would never know her mother's arms again. Her title of princess was stripped from her future uncertain. Yet even in the cradle of disgrace, destiny stirred. Those who visited her remarked on her fierce eyes, her intelligence beyond her years. A spark of her mother lives in her still, one attendant said. No one could yet imagine that this motherless girl, born under suspicion and baptized in scandal, would one day wear the crown her mother had died to give her. As the sun set over the tower, the faint sound of evening bells carried across the Thames. Beneath the chapel floor, and Boleyn lay in her unmarked grave, her name erased from official ceremony, her existence reduced to a warning. Yet even then, her story was not finished. It had only shifted. From life to legend, from flesh to myth, the courtiers who betrayed her would die in their turn, their names forgotten, but Anne's whispered in the dark, sung in secret, written in the margins of history, would endure. And somewhere in the wind that swept over London that night, it was said one could still hear her voice, soft, defiant, eternal, whispering, "My Elizabeth shall reign."